Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Thank you for joining me on this video presentation and or podcast live stream on Jean-Luc Marion against Immanuel Kant, reason and revelation. So for Jean-Luc Marion, the key word there is and. Reason and revelation, at least in terms of the possibilities of revelation. So in this video, I want to talk about Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason and what he defines as the four principles of understanding in terms of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. What he means by this and how Marion challenges what he thinks are ultimately superficial limits of experience and perception and understanding with Kant, while respecting what Kant is doing, trying to fill out the picture through the method of phenomenology and think together about what might be some phenomena that give themselves in such a way that exceed the four principles of understanding as understood by Immanuel Kant, that exceed these predetermined categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So this content is a bit technical, but I think it's important at least to think toward it. We might not be successful in thinking it comprehensively in an hour's time, but nevertheless, with Kant, thinking along with Kant, trying to understand the way he understands understanding, and then thinking along with Marion how his concept of the saturated phenomenon would disturb these comfortable categories of idealism. Okay, so one of Marion's primary targets of critique is the transcendental logic of Immanuel Kant. In his critique of pure reason, Kant asserts four principles of pure understanding that he views to be sine qua non transcendental conditions of possibility for understanding, necessary conditions of possibility for understanding. Number one, Kant calls these axioms of intuition. Another way to say this is quantity. We'll talk more about what each of these means. So number one, axioms of intuition or quantity. Number two, anticipations of perception or quality. Number three, analogies of experience, relation. And number four, postulates of empirical thought as such, modality. So what more can we say about this in Kant? In his critique of pure reason, Kant describes these four principles of understanding. Let's talk about each of them in turn the best we can, and I'll write a bit on the board to do this. It'll help us understand what Kant is meaning here with these pure principles of pure understanding. How we understand a thing, how we know a thing, in these kinds of terms. This goes back to Aristotle's various categories. These would be four of them, these classical categories, through which we can know a thing, know a being. But for Kant, it's to understand something happening in experience. So these are Kant's four principles of pure understanding. So number one is in terms of quantity, which he also calls this axioms of intuition, whose principle is that all intuitions are extensive magnitudes. So quantity in terms of an extensive magnitude. So there's a givenness of perception here, but then in the mind, how the mind is receiving a quantity of noumenon become phenomenon in the mind for Kant. And so let's take the example of a dog. We know something is a dog, and you might hear one in the background as we are watching my sister-in-law's sheepadoodle dog this week. So you might hear some barking. You might hear some scratching at the door. But how do we know something is a dog rather than a cat, rather than a horse, rather than a fish, a bird, a mosquito? There's a certain extensive magnitude of the thing that gives itself to perception for understanding. So the shape of the dog, the size of the dog, the proportionality of the dog in itself, first, this is what I'm working with. So a certain quantity, amount, in terms of big or small, long or short, heavy or light, all of these various quantity and extensive magnitude of a thing. The second principle for pure understanding for Kant is under the rubric of quality. Quality, he talks about quality as anticipation of perception, whose principle is that in all appearances, the real that is an object of sensation has an intensive magnitude. So intensive magnitude rather than extensive magnitude. So in the experience of a dog, for example, there's a quality, not only extensive in a more empirical sense here in terms of the thing. If we, again, a dog has an objective shape, form. In natural science, we'll talk about the molecular constitution of the objective form, all the parts that make up the form, the fur, the teeth, the eyes, the internal organs, the paws, and so on. But intensive magnitude, the quality of a thing, has to do with, again, anticipations of perception, whose principle is that in all appearances, the real that is an object of sensation has an intensive magnitude, a degree, a quality of its giving. So if the dog barks, is the bark loud, soft? What's its timbre? Is it rough, high-pitched, low-pitched? Does it provoke fear? Like all of these different things, the quality. If I pet the dog, is this soft, rough fur? What's the intensity of the experience happening here from noumenon to phenomenon? And so the understanding itself depends on these categories for there to be an actual experience and in turn understanding what is it that I am experiencing. This is what Kant is getting. How can I know this is a dog I'm experiencing? It has to do, again, one, with extensive magnitude, two, with intensive magnitude. So you hear the bark in the background. Number three has to do with relation. We say relation of what? How does Kant understand relation as a principle of pure understanding? Relation, analogies of experience whose principle is that, quote from Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, experience is possible only through the presentation of a necessary connection of perceptions. So connection, necessary connection of perceptions. So again, we're talking about the example of a dog. In the case of a dog, I hear a bark. How do I know this is a dog? Because I've experienced such perceptions before. So I can relate my current perception to previous ones. So to understand relation, again, analogies of experience. I can relate analogously the current experience to a past one. Or in the present, multiple experiences happening once, and I'm relating them to each other, so that on one hand, I'm dealing with a dog, on the other hand, I'm dealing with a wall, I'm dealing with a marker, I'm dealing with myself. And so I'm relating all of these individual beings, all of these different perceptions in a connected way. I'm ordering them within understanding and differentiating and making important distinctions where they need to be made. So, analogies of experience, whose principle is that experience is possible only through. So, that's why Kant is talking about conditions of possibility for experience. So, he's saying, I can experience something only in as much as it comes to me through its phenomenal manifestation in my uh, cogito, my cognition of the phenomenon, of the noumenon as represented in the phenomenality of my mind. This is Kant. This is not phenomenology. We're going to get back to Marion, but first we have to think with Kant here. So, in order for me to understand a thing, there must be extensive magnitude, intensive magnitude, connections of perceptions through the analogy of experience, which he's calling relation. And so it's like coming clean with what is actually happening through the process of knowing a thing and understanding a thing. We have to think through this in a very ordered way, a systematic way. And is not Kant telling the truth about how subjectivity works, how the ego works to understand a thing? Yes, he's getting very detailed about this like never before in the history of Western philosophy. And this is why he studied so much in graduate level philosophy programs, because he took the time to think through all of these things and dissect the invisible yet real processes of thought. So there's one more point here for Kant, and then we'll see how Marion deals with each of these in terms of the saturated phenomenon. And the last piece is what Kant calls modality. Again, it's a principle of pure understanding, a condition, a necessary condition of possibility for perceiving a thing, knowing a thing, and above all, understanding a thing, differentiating one thing from another through the cognitive process that we would call understanding. So what is modality? This one's a bit more complicated. He talks about modality in terms of postulates of empirical thought as such, whose principles include three things. A, what agrees in terms of intuition and concepts with the formal conditions of experience is possible. So modality has three types. One has to do with possible experiences. And a possible experience is what would agree in terms of intuition and concepts with the formal conditions of experience. So intuition is one thing, concept is another. Or we might say the percept is joined to the concept and understanding. So there's a percept, there's an intuition that has to do with the givenness of a thing, and Kant would call it first the noumenon, the thing in itself, but then he'll talk about the phenomenon, the noumenon as experienced by the human subject. And here, modality is in terms of the necessary conditions of possibility required for that work of the mind to join the concept with the percept or the intuition of the thing giving itself, ultimately as phenomenon in the mind. So in the case of a dog, I have the concept of dog already. Since childhood, I came to know what is a dog in my childhood understanding. And so if I hear a bark, if I see a four-legged furry creature walking along the sidewalk, I pet it, it's wagging the tail. What are we dealing with here? Well, modality is saying that the mind always bears the possibility of joining the concept dog with the perception of a thing that may actually be one, may actually be a dog. So the process, the modality, starting with possibility of I have an arsenal of concepts ready to go with an experience, and I'm perceiving all these things, and I look and say light, book, pencil, car, cup of tea, clouds. And again, all these examples are objects, but then I might talk about feelings, emotions, joy, sadness, fear, hope. I might talk about aspects um, of philosophy of mind. All these concepts we're using, cognition, consciousness, phenomenon, noumenon, all of these concepts have something, an actual thing associated with them, related to them. But modality is starting with the possibility, the conditional possibility of the possibility of joining concepts with what's coming through intuition for the sake of understanding. Because I say I understand a thing once I complete the process, once I close the loop on assigning a concept to a given perception, a given phenomenon that my mind is dealing with. So it's like pin the concept on the phenomenon, is what this modality, in terms of possibility, is getting at. But B, the second kind of modality, Kant says, is what coheres with the material conditions of experience in terms of sensation. So empirical conditions of experience, this is what he learned from David Hume, for example, what we would say is an actual modality of something. So I can't deal eidetically in my mind with putting together concepts and percepts unless I actually have sense data to work with. So the actuality of sense data gives us the concrete material and the sensate building blocks to assign concepts to intuitions of consciousness. Okay, and then C, the last type of modality he talks about, um, that whose coherence with the actual is determined according to universal conditions of experience. So a coherence with the actual, which he already talked about, which means empirical and sensory, uh, that coheres with the actual determined according to universal conditions of experience. So universal conditions of experience, those which exist necessarily. So that is the necessary, is the third type of modality. And this is what we would call modern metaphysics. The necessary conditions of possibility for knowing a thing in a universal way. Fundamental necessary conditions of possibility related to the principle of sufficient reason. So, what is necessary to adjudicate among all of these percepts with the concepts? We might say a thinking subject, something that necessarily exists is the case. And so necessity has its own category in terms of modality to ground understanding in, we could say, an epistemological metaphysics. a metaphysics of mind, first principles that are necessary for us to understand anything at all. So we first must have a thinking subject. We must have the attempt to perceive a thing, to know a thing, to understand a thing. And so this is a global category of modality that applies to all people in every circumstance for there to be actual rational understanding. For example, for if we're going to talk about sound, there have to be ears to hear. This is necessary to receive a sound and to deal with the sound. There need to be eyes to see. There need to be these senses that will deal with this type of modality called actual or empirical. So the necessary, the possible, and the actual are joined together within this principle of modality for pure understanding. Okay, this is Immanuel Kant. This is his Critique of Pure Reason. And in sum, for Kant, a phenomenon appears, therefore, only in a sight that is predefined by a system of coordinates, a system that is itself governed by the principle of the unity of experience. Okay, so what does that mean? That's saying that for Kant, for a human subject to experience a thing, in turn to know a thing, in turn to understand a thing, that we have to have a predefined system of coordinates, epistemological coordinates, through which to receive a thing, to situate a thing, to then know it conceptually, and to understand it. For Kantian idealism, to know a thing is everything is going on in the mind. The mind is what's knowing. The mind is dealing with all it can within its field of cognition, and so it's that all those processes he's attending to in this Critique of Pure Reason. So a predefined system of coordinates, a system that itself is governed by the principle of the unity of experience. We don't have a fragmented experience because of the unity of all of this, all of these predetermined, predefined system of epistemological coordinates to know. So this is like the keyboard of experience. For it to be legible, for it to be rational, for it to be knowable, I have to have all of these things functioning. Otherwise, I may experience something very fragmentary and have no idea what is it, understand it not at all, maybe not even recognize it as a perception. But all of this, Kant says, we have to have in place to understand the thing. With all the heavy lifting that Immanuel Kant does here in the Critique of Pure Reason, we might still be left to wonder, what about that relationship between the noumenon, the thing in itself, and the phenomenon, the thing as I experience it within my mind? Is there a hiatus between the two, a gap, a caesura? For Kant, there is. For Edmund Husserl, there is not. For phenomenology, there is not. So phenomenology is a movement, a new chapter in Western philosophy that knows Kant well and relies on this Kantian investigation of subjectivity, but wants to return to the objectivity of experience. And for Husserl, that is zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves. And Husserl, through his transcendental reduction, brings together a unity of the noumenon and the phenomenon that altogether he calls the phenomenon, the givenness of the thing itself for consciousness. And phenomenology gets more radical, especially through Marion. So now I want to talk about how Jean-Luc Marion, through his concept of the saturated phenomenon, keeps all of this in mind from Kant, but shows how each of these predefined categories that form a system of coordinates for knowledge and understanding, how each of these categories is transgressed by the saturated phenomenon, transgressed, exceeded, overcome, and how, in effect, these Kantian categories and principles of pure understanding are unwarranted in the face of the phenomena that we actually experience. So I'll put the board down and go to some text. Here, thinking with Marion then. So Kant is known with this principles of pure understanding for developing the boundaries or limits of phenomenality. Essentially, for Kant, there's boundaries or limits. Kant draws the distinction between noumena and phenomena and carefully identifies what he sees to be the conditions for any and all phenomenal appearing to consciousness. Marion challenges this notion directly with his own concept of the saturated phenomenon, in French, phénomène saturé. Marion contends for the side of possibility, construing even the possibility of divine revelation as that which would occur in the form of the saturated phenomenon par excellence. He does this to oppose those who would deem the phenomena of revelation as impossible. So taking from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an Etude in Phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion. Okay, so thank you for those who have come in the chat. Maybe I take a pause and look at these and respond a bit. And so thank you for the compliments. And to think along with Kant, it's a territory far and wide. So, I don't do Kant justice in trying to sum up his 4 principles of pure understanding so quickly. There's a lot more to think about here. So I think the comments are getting at that, different examples. So good. I think we do well to continue with Marion, breaking through the aporia of revelation. Because for Immanuel Kant, it's rationalism. It's philosophical rationalism. There is no room for divinity to give itself as something for understanding. God is a limit concept for Kant, a postulate of pure reason, something the mind comes up against and can think no more. So what has philosophy to do with God and Kant other than delimit thought? Kant, we can't say much about God. So Kant, though he does say much about ethics and this categorical imperative and the metaphysics of morals, he'll talk about all of this. He'll formulate an ethics of modernity, but it's a rationalist foundation, not being informed by revelation directly. The stuff of scripture and tradition, of a given religious tradition. In his context, a kind of Christianized Europe. But Marion, for his part, wants to open to the question of divinity to consider through the method of phenomenology. And if we're considering the question of divinity, not in terms of classical metaphysics, in the terms of the ontology of God, or ontotheology, as Heidegger critiqued it, what about the givenness of divinity? And if divinity gives itself, what about the self-revelation, communication of divinity? We have much evidence that this has gone on around the world throughout human history. And phenomenology isn't so much interested in asking a quick question, well, is all this true or not? It's simply interested to attend to the data, investigate the data of lived experience and the testimonies of the witnesses about their own lived experiences. For phenomenology, everything is fair game. Whereas for Kantian idealism, there's a boundary. We can't exceed. We can't let anything on the hinter side of the boundary come to us. There's a wall. So Thank you for the question, Val. The tradition I hail from, uh, maybe you see the iconography. And if I say what tradition I hail from, perhaps I pollute the philosophy. uh, because, uh, especially when we're doing phenomenology, because if I say I'm Catholic or I'm Orthodox or I'm Jewish or I'm Muslim or Buddhist, or I'm atheist or anything, am I not introducing a kind of uh, premature answering to all the questions we're asking? So to respond to what tradition I hail from, uh, uh, we'll get to that, and maybe if I was able to say so, express that, we could at least hold in suspense any kind of judgment when doing phenomenology. So I was raised in the tradition of Roman Catholicism, and that is what I believe in practice to this day. Uh, but Roman Catholicism itself has a rich philosophical tradition, and the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. But the whole Judeo-Christian tradition is in conversation historically with Islam, with Arabian scholars, with the scholars of Asia, Confucianism, for instance, Taoism, Hinduism, the Vedas, the Upanishads, all of these things. So when I think as a thinker, as a philosopher, I want to think toward the whole. I want to dialogue with everything in the name of thinking toward the whole, with the confidence that the truth is the whole. So Catholicism as a term means that, uh, thinking toward the whole, being toward the whole, living toward the whole. And yes, Catholicism involves a particular revelation of divinity, above all through Jesus of Nazareth. And these move us into theology. But if we're using a philosophical method of phenomenology to explore possibilities of divinity and divine revelation, this is at the first level of reflection. So before we go to any presumed doctrines, we want to maintain the primacy of the questions here. And that's what we're doing, to think along with Immanuel Kant and to think along with Jean-Luc Marion. Uh, not being suspicious that the deck has been stacked in their philosophy and what they're saying. Yeah, so it is a rather objective approach. It is keeping things at arm's reach with the confidence that the truth will show itself. The truth will speak itself along the way. And we're gathering up data, evidence, coordinating all of this to form not only a great constellation of meaning and meaningfulness, but even truth. Phenomenology can take us so far in this pursuit, and then the ball will have to be passed to classical metaphysics to make a judgment in the end. This is what I believe and why. Phenomenology does not ask the question why, because to ask the question of why gets us into the whole grammar and concepts of metaphysics, of being. If I respond in English to a why question, I use the language of because, which is getting at the causality of a being, because. And that's very good for philosophy, and it has its place. And I would say it's foundational, actually. But right now, what we're doing is phenomenology as phenomenology. So we don't ask why or what is it, we ask what gives. And we ask, how does it give itself by itself as the phenomenon? So that's what Marion is doing in his careful work, uh, through this dialogue with Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. So Marion, through reference to the phenomenality of divine revelation, at least in terms of possibility, Marion demonstrates the various ways in which Kant's principles of pure understanding do not take into account the full and excessive possibilities of phenomenality. This is the problem with a lot of thinking, especially in rationalist kinds of worldviews, is that the boundaries of the possible are set in advance, and they're very limited. It's like, in the United States, we have the game of 100-yard long fields and 55 or so yards across or something like that. And so it's a wide rectangle for you to have 11 people on one team, 11 people on the other playing against each other. But it's like what can happen in philosophy is we narrow the playing field in advance to something like 50 yards by 25 yards for still 22 people to play within this. And we put boundaries on something in advance. And this is what phenomenology calls natural attitude that involves some kind of reductionistic thinking, whether in the form of fundamentalism on one extreme or relativism on the other. So um, phenomenology wants to bracket the unwarranted brackets that we put prematurely on our analysis of lived experience. So Marion is calling into question Kant's delimitation of the possibilities of experience in terms of his principles of pure understanding, quantity, quality, relation, modality. And while Marion appreciates what Kant is doing here, he's saying perhaps we need a wider field of vision. Can our philosophical method of phenomenology grant us this wider field of vision as it begins with the bracketing of natural attitude? So, in general terms, phenomenology will recognize what Kant is doing within a certain school of philosophy that has been called idealism or subjectivism, and it says, okay, we're dealing with a lot here, but can we reduce the whole of philosophy to the human subject with the Cartesian turn to the human subject in the 17th century on? Or is there something that we're starting to miss in terms of the objective givenness of things in themselves? Is it possible there is actually a unity between the thing in itself and the thing known? This Edmund Husserl argues in all of his work. He says yes against Kantian idealism. He fills out the hermeneutic to restore the proper objectivities of things in themselves in relation to the subjectivity of the thing's reception and thought. So Marion is doing the same thing, but Marion is going to go after one at a time here. In terms of uh, the Kantian categories for pure understanding, Marion is going to talk about how a saturated phenomenon will transgress these superficial idealist categories within experience. So, for instance, Kantian category of quantity in terms of extensive magnitude is challenged by the phenomenon of the event. When we're, to talk about a dog is one thing, to talk about an event is another. And the phenomenality of event saturates these predetermined categories that simply want to attach concepts to percepts. And in an event, there's too much meaning and signification giving itself. There's so much. It's a surge, it's a flood. And if we take subjectivity as a kind of tabula rasa for this new lived experience of an event, it can't keep track of everything going on in the event. This is why we have the study of history. There's all these events that have happened, and we're still trying to interpret them. Even events that happened centuries and millennia ago. We're still trying to make sense of them, interpret them, because Marion says every event lends itself to an infinite hermeneutics, an unending project of interpretation. So Kantian idealism in the face of an event, it's like a hurricane comes and just destroys the architecture, destroys the structure, knocks it down. The saturated phenomenon overcomes the Kantian conceptual readiness for understanding. So for phenomenology, the first goal is not to try to understand a thing. It's simply to receive it as it gives itself, to live into what is giving itself to the human subject. So an event, it's like, may I be enveloped, exposed, immersed in the event. And for a phenomenologist, then we receive so much. And all we're trying to do, first of all, is receive more by continuing to bracket the natural attitude more effectively. Reduce all the temptations to reductionism that would be in the way for receiving things as they give themselves by themselves, especially in terms of their meaning, their signification. For Husserl, their eidetic objectivity. For Heidegger, the self-manifestation of Sein, of being, through Seiendes, other beings in the field of experience across the horizon of experience. And for Marion, the radical reduction to givenness itself. What is giving itself in the event? All the phenomena that are lighting up there, and again, lend themselves to an infinite hermeneutic. So any sense of quantity, extensive magnitude, an event you can't measure with number. You can't quantify an event. So if you can't quantify an event in terms of extensive magnitude and turn it into a measurable, it doesn't mean we should disqualify the event and its givenness. But what needs to be disqualified is the Kantian limitations put on receiving the event. And at least admit that this Kantian category of quantity is exceeded, in a sense, incapacitated. And to describe that experience of being dispossessed of one's attempt to master the phenomenon, to understand the phenomenon, to conceptualize the phenomenon adequately or exhaustively, is a very great breakthrough for philosophy, because it's emptying the ego of its hubris, and that's incredibly important, because if the ego approaches everything that says every phenomenon has to play according to my rules, my terms, this is where we get atheism, for example, as a worldview. Atheism says, all I believe in is empirical sense data, and God is not one of these, therefore God does not exist. Is it God that doesn't exist? Or is it that these superficial borders of the possible don't exist? Because so much is actually giving itself more than these borders. So the second point, Marion's category of the idol, besets the Kantian category of quality in terms of intensive magnitude. Because in the case of the idol, the phenomenon of an idol is fashioned according to humanity's attempt to envisage the divine, whereby, Marion says in his book, The Idol and Distance, an idol is when human experience precedes the face that a particular divinity assumes in it. The idol fixes the divine for us permanently, for a commerce where the human hems in the divine from all angles. I think Marion describes the phenomenality of the idol so precisely. And this is the problem with an idol, is, as one of my professors in biblical theology at Loyola University Chicago, Dr. Pauline Viviano, said one class, God created us and then we returned the favor. We create God in the human image. That is what we call an idol. When we may discount divinity and its own possibilities, or we may assign them. And we may worship what in fact has its own limits, thereby contradicting the very concept of divinity, which means infinite, no limits. So in the idol, again, human experience precedes the face of divinity and then paints it, shapes it, and said, "This is the face of divinity that we assign to it." So the classic story in Judaism, in the Hebrew scriptures, of the people of Israel in the desert. Moses is up on Mount Sinai, praying to God, and the people get impatient and create a golden calf. We see this all over the ancient world. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Why do people create idols and worship them? It's like it's irrational. So this experience of an idol, again, it exceeds the Kantian category of quality in terms of intensive magnitude. Because the idol is formed strictly according to human determination, acts not as a translucent mediator that discloses divine mystery, but simply as a mirror reflecting only the human onlooker, exhausting every aim, allowing no invisibility to illuminate the gaze, in effect burying the gaze through narcissistic inversion. So Marion says in his book, God Without Being, the idol presents itself to man's gaze in order that representation, and hence knowledge, can seize hold of it. It captivates the gaze only inasmuch as the gazeable comprises it. So, what the experience of the idol is doing to the Kantian category of quality is inauthenticating it. Because we can't be sure. Is it the knower who is creating the known? Or is it the known that is giving itself to the knower? It perplexes the human subject within the experience. And so this is something, the idol, the experience of the idol is troubling this category of quality. And for Marion, idolatry can be purely conceptual also. And this is where, in a sense, Marion beats Kant at his own game and shows how these um, idealistically fabricated coordinates for knowledge and understanding can turn against themselves in the attempt to know and understand, and raise more questions, introduce more doubtfulness into the experience. And this is what idolatry does to people. It befuddles us, it flummoxes us, it makes us confused. You know, we can say that we become what we worship. We become like what we worship. And if what we're worshiping is something not worthy of worship, then our own dignity is undermined and confused. And we don't know which way is north, south, east, or west. So idolatry as an experience, at least we can say, confuses what was said to be a category that sets up pure understanding in Kant. The second category, specifically called quality, because I don't know if I'm the one creating the quality or if the quality is giving itself to me from the thing itself in idolatry. It's a room of mirrors, and I don't know which one is true. Third point of the saturated phenomenon, how it exceeds the Kantian category of relation. So relation, the Kantian category of relation, would be absolved by the phenomenality of the unsubstitutable auto-affecting flesh. So the auto-affectivity of the flesh. So let's take my flesh, for example. No one can substitute himself or herself for me in terms of the auto-affectivity of my flesh. It gives itself. I experience it directly, oftentimes without thinking about it, but it's unsubstitutable. So when it comes to the auto-affectivity of my flesh, I can't relate it to anything else. I can't coordinate the autoaffectivity of my flesh with another one because of its immediacy. So in terms of relation as a connection of perceptions, I can't make the connection because of the imminent, automatic, direct, immediate autoaffectivity of my own flesh. So this is relying on Michel Henry's work, The Essence of Manifestation, autoaffectivity, the flesh, the body, the self. So the flesh itself deflects the attempt to relate it to something more than itself, more than what's going on across one's skin, beneath one's skin. The autoaffectivity of the flesh. It's not an object to be related to other objects. The experience of one's own flesh, what we're calling the autoaffectivity of the flesh feeling itself, is beyond the attempt to relate it to itself, to relate it to another, in terms of that experience of autoaffectivity of the flesh. It's in a sense an incarnate absolute. So Kant, in this category of relation, has in mind, first of all, a world of objects for sure, because part of his project is informed by British empiricism of David Hume, Scottish empiricism, I should say, of David Hume, and so to think in terms of a world of objects, like in terms of dogs and pencils and cars and trees and rocks, and even the eidetic object of cognition in terms of knowledge and understanding and consciousness and intuition, phenomenon, perception, all of these eidetic objects we're talking about in idealism presuppose the ability of the analogy of experience to relate one thing to another, or even in terms of one experience to the next. In this experience, I'm experiencing a cat before me. In this experience, a dog. In a previous experience, a peacock. And so I can differentiate all of these different animals because through the analogy of experience. Oh, I've had the experience of this before or this other one before, and I can relate. When it comes to the autoaffectivity of the flesh, I can't differentiate a previous experience from the present one or a future one because there's such a seamless unity. It's because it's what St. Edith Stein calls a 0 point of orientation here, that I can't peel away from it. The 0 point of orientation remains, and I can't relate it to another one. In my ego life, I can't. So Marion says there's a saturation of the flesh saturating itself in what's called the autoaffectivity of the flesh. So this Kantian category is transgressed as a principle of pure understanding. And number 4, the last one, the Kantian category of modality is surpassed by the phenomenon of the icon. Why the icon? Unlike the idol, the icon does not result from a vision, but provokes one. In the case of the icon, there's a kind of unmanipulatable givenness, an alterity, a personal alterity that's happening through the face of the icon facing me. And we have a crossing of gazes here, a definite unpredictability of encounter. The iconography can also be applied to interpersonal relationship in every case. The face-to-face relationship, thinking in Levinasian terms, for example, there's an entirely unpredictability of encounter. So the icon maintains the presentation of the invisible. There's something sacramental about the icon, a presentation of the invisible in and through the visible by summoning the gaze the onlooker, to surpass itself by preventing a freezing of the visible, instead giving rise to an infinite gaze that would surpass the Kantian types of modality, both in terms of possibility, actuality, and necessity. When we have the crossing of gazes, as Marion calls it, through the experience of an icon, there it gives rise to an infinite gazing, whose possibilities I have no idea. It can't be reduced to an empirical experience. We're not talking about the paint that makes up the icon here. We're talking about the givenness of the invisible through the visible, through a crossing of gazes, and this overall experience in which I'm being looked at too. And when I'm being looked at, I cannot control what does this other think of me, what does this other have in mind for me. I can't reduce the gaze of the other to an object of natural science or anything empirical. I can't foresee or anticipate in any way accurately the possibilities of the look of the other, the voice of the other, the approach of the other, what Marion calls the advance of the other. I can't dominate this. And in terms of necessity, the question is inverted. When it comes to the experience of the icon, it is not just me who's doing the question asking, and it's not just me who is situating any necessary conditions of possibility for phenomenal appearing. But at the very least, we might say that there could be conditions being imposed on me. The tables are turned. This category of modality for pure understanding, I can't circumscribe through an understanding. I can't look at the other in such a way that I pin them down. I've got them in place. I'm at the mercy of the gaze of the other when it comes to the icon. So here we have these four categories saturating the Kantian principles of pure understanding. Again, the event saturating quantity, the idol saturating quality, the flesh and its feeling autoaffectivity, saturating relation, and the icon saturating modality. But here, to wrap up this session, Marion goes further to apply his theory of the saturated phenomenon in the case of divine revelation and a specific instance of it, who is called Jesus the Christ. A specific instance of a divine revelation. And he makes the distinction between lowercase r revelation and uppercase r, capital R revelation, in his book, Being Given, for example. So lowercase r revelation could apply to any religious tradition whatsoever, universally speaking, and the possibilities of generic revelation, of generic divinity. But uppercase revelation, capital R revelation, means a very specific proposal of it, whether we're talking about in Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and so on. We even can do things within the worldview of atheism in terms of the divinity being excluded or denied. So it doesn't matter for phenomenology. We can investigate it all just as well and gather up the data, gather up the evidence or lack of evidence, gather up the meanings, and then relate them to each other. And then phenomenology, its work is never ending in this way. It's never done sifting for gold. So Marion wants to take an example, the case of Christ. And what he's doing here, again, it's a proposal of possibility. It's not assuming the actuality of God and God's revelation in Christ as uh, a judgment. It's not phenomenology is not involving a judgment. This is real. This is true. What is real for phenomenology is the data of givenness, and we have plenty in every religious experience and every religious tradition that need investigating. So he's doing that within the context of Christianity, which is indigenous to him. And so for Marion, uh, we have the event, the idol, the flesh, the icon that come into play within Christianity. Christ is an instance not only of the saturated phenomenon, but what do we have in Christ in this particular proposal, this particular givenness of divine revelation is a saturation of saturation. This is how it can be described, God's revelation in Jesus Christ. Doubly paradoxical insofar as God assumes the form of radical gift through Christ and the incarnation of God in Christ that floods the horizon of phenomenality, though in the end, through his crucifixion and his death, through this radical humility and the pattern of it on display in his life, his teachings, all of this appears as a shortage bearing the name the abandoned. So in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, as the story goes, he lived, he worked in carpentry, and then he began a 3-year itinerant ministry and mission of preaching and teaching and healing and exorcising demons. And then he's arrested and condemned to death. He's imprisoned, he's tortured, he's condemned to death. And even non-Christian authors attest to the historical facts of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And he's crucified. So for Christianity, we have an immense paradox here. If this story is about God becoming human, shouldn't he be invincible? Shouldn't he save the day by just willing it good and so and but he's put to death. And everything he did and taught and seems to come to an abrupt end. Horrific, tragic end. Done. And on the cross, as the biblical witness attests, he quoted the psalm, my God, why have you abandoned me? What is this? This one is supposed to be God in the flesh, but saying, my God, why have you abandoned me? So Marion is simply describing what we receive in lived experience in this proposal of divine revelation called Christianity. And he's saying what we have here in terms of the data, in terms of the evidence, is a paradox, is even a saturation of saturation. If indeed this is the revelation of God, we have a saturation of saturation appearing in the form of humility, littleness, smallness, as we read in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 53, about this suffering servant who no one really cared to look at or pay attention to. So the proposal of divine revelation in Christianity is very paradoxical. The king whose crown is made of thorns, whose throne is a harsh cross of wood, and he's nailed to it, and then his corpse is taken down and buried in a tomb. We have to think this revelation all the way through its extremity of darkness and abandonment and loss. And as human beings, there's something that's already resonating with us in terms of, I suffer too. I face death too. I face the death of my loved ones. I face my own death, with Heidegger and this being towards death. Okay. And here we have a savior figure, a revelation of God said to come through this man. How is this giving itself? This is very strange. This is very unusual. So Marion is saying, okay, let's go back to the Kantian principles for pure understanding and think about Jesus Christ as a saturated phenomenon, an instance, a testimony of divine revelation. So Christ saturates quantity, the Kantian category of quantity, in the form of eventfulness. His gospel, his person, is composed of many events, actually. The whole eventfulness of the revelation itself. It's not just a verbal message, a written message. It's a written and oral testimony, artistic testimony to these events. We could say the event of Jesus Christ, which sums up all these events that make up him. So, yes, and we can situate that socially, historically, culturally in a milieu that predated Jesus of Nazareth. And we make sense of this in light of the Hebrew scriptures, in light of, as you say, Val, the context of an era, Bacchic mystery cults of Hellenism, interpreted through Greek philosophy eventually in the early councils. And so I'll get through how Christ is saturated phenomenon and come back to your questions in the chat. So Christ saturates quantity in the form of his eventfulness. He saturates quality in the form of his bedazzling appearance all the way through cross and resurrection. Even today, August 6th, as I make this video, in the Roman Catholic Church, it's the Feast of the Transfiguration of Jesus we read about in the Gospels, where his appearance was bedazzling. So he saturates relation in the form of his incarnate flesh that cannot be circumscribed by the world of common law phenomena, but rather transgresses them through his apophatic epiphany and unsubstitutability. No one can take the place of the Messiah in this Judeo-Christian tradition. There's something about the auto-affectivity of the flesh of Christ that isn't absolute, that also will saturate this category, Kantian category of relation. And finally, Christ saturates modality in the iconic form of his person, whereby instead of the ego constituting him to its liking, he constitutes the human subject by his loving and forgiving gaze. That is entirely unpredictable, unmerited, and unforeseen. So in this way, Marion contrasts Kant's position in which there is no room for the phenomenon of revelation, divine revelation. Marion brings together the notion of givenness with the particularities of phenomenal possibility in his construal of the phenomenon of revelation, namely the saturated phenomenon that appears on the limited horizons of intentionality, as well as the limited parameters of the Kantian principles of pure understanding. And it saturates them. It saturates the intentional aim of the human subject with unrelenting intuition. We have no concepts ready to take on this saturating phenomena. For Marion, not only is Christ a doubly saturated phenomenon, Christ is to be worshipped and adored insofar as his bedazzling divinity calls forth such an absolute response according to its unreserved giving to the point of abandonment. This is the common paradigm of every hero figure, the one who dies to save the other. The paradigmatic form of heroism. We have this in Christ. And later in this book, I talk about, quoting the theologian David Tracy and philosopher, the paradigmatic is the real. And we can continue to think about that. So finally, the Eucharist as the sacramental extension of the incarnation of God and the saving death and resurrection of Christ as the incarnation of God, the Eucharist as the central sacrament of the Christian tradition, is the fullest expression of this total self-giving of Christ, as it extends the sacrificial offering of Christ crucified, as well as the redemptive grace or gift of his resurrection from the dead, under the most humiliating appearance of food and drink. So it would be reductionistic to limit a description of this religious phenomena in rationalist terms alone. The point is that divine revelation exceeds the aptitude and capacities of human reason. Like, that's what's meant by divine revelations, an alterity in relation to human reason. And the whole thing about phenomenology, going back to Husserl, is that new life is breathed into philosophy thanks to the alterity of the phenomenon. Moreover, for Marion, the alterity of divine revelation as one of the most interesting phenomena we have to investigate because of its caliber, because of how it saturates. It's worthy of our investigation and taking time to describe. So that's what he does. The phenomenon of Jesus Christ involves interpersonal encounter, the crossing of gazes, a living iconography of personhood. And it exhibits an intrinsic iconicity that must be explored through Marion's illuminating hermeneutic of the saturated phenomenon. All right. So, yes, we have all these things to take into account. Again, a main critique of Marion's philosophy is going to be his inattentiveness to hermeneutics that we get in a Paul Ricoeur, that we get in Immanuel Levinas, a Hans-Georg Gadamer, a Heidegger, especially late Heidegger. Jacques Derrida. Marion focuses on manifestation. And I call it in this book, his is a phenomenology of manifestation, in contrast to another type called a phenomenology of proclamation, where we have those I just mentioned that attend to hermeneutical things. So I want to go back to Imran's question here. Does Marion agree with Heidegger in seeing evental appropriation as primordial to the experience of saturated phenomena? Is hermeneutics embedded in the experience? So the way Marion is different than Heidegger is that he's much more like Husserl. As I said in a previous video, Marion eventually will critique Heidegger by going back to Husserl and this quest, not just for objectivity, but for givenness. And Marion does not want to set up any terms and conditions for the givenness of phenomena to give themselves. Even for Heidegger, we have a matrix of interpretation that he sets in place for us to receive phenomena. And we could call this the matrix of being in the world, and the receptivity ultimately of the self-showing of Sein, of being, through Seiendes, beings, along the horizon of the Umwelt, through this process he calls Ereignis, this event of the appropriation of the meaning of being, through the proprietor, Dasein. For Marion, he's bracketing Dasein, he's bracketing Sein, he's bracketing Umwelt, he's bracketing any hermeneutical matrix that would be ready to go, any hermeneutical filters. Marion is trying to bracket all of it, and he's setting all this aside. He's appreciating what's going on in a Heidegger, but Marion is not talking about Ereignis. The most he's saying is that the givenness of the phenomenon lends itself, like the event phenomenon, is the gift that keeps on giving for interpretation. But the matrices of interpretation itself are made by the givenness of the phenomenon. So it's a totally different approach. Again, when we think of the two main players in phenomenality, there's the phenomenon and the human subject. And we see a lot of differences among phenomenologists. And how much attention are they giving to subjectivity? How much attention are they giving to, I don't want to say objectivity because that's too facile, that's oversimplified, and it's not true to the kinds of givenness that can happen and give themselves beyond categories of objectivity. So we have subjectivity and givenness. We have interpretation and givenness. So Heidegger is dealing a lot more with those in hermeneutical layers through which we receive phenomena. Marion is trying to bracket all of these layers, reduce them, get them out of the way, make a clearing as much as possible for the self to become a tabula rasa in relation to the phenomenon. And so the phenomenon is the point for Marion, and everything is concentrated there. So that's how he's quite different than Heidegger. And what I argue in this book, though, for the full picture of phenomenology, again, we need to combine forces of all these thinkers. So we don't put them in competition, in other words. We don't say Marion was right, Heidegger was wrong. We don't say the latest one has everything right and the past phenomenologists were missing things. There's new breakthroughs, but in as much as we continue to gather up the whole of the tradition, of this philosophical tradition. And so we need givenness and hermeneutics. And that's exactly what this book is doing through reference to a religious experience, a religious phenomenon in the Judeo-Christian tradition called the Eucharist, a sacrament, in which we see both of these cylinders firing to the same high degree. Uh, and so, like in the Christian liturgy, we have liturgy of the word, liturgy of the Eucharist. We have proclamation and manifestation. We have word and sacrament. And so when we get this insight from a religious belief and practice, we can see what's going on in the evolution of a philosophical tradition too here, because it's a very common process, a polarity, a dialectic to happen. And that's what we see in the history of phenomenology, the dialectic between manifestation and proclamation, between appearance and interpretation, between gift and ethics, between contemplation and responsibility for the other. And we bring all this together. It's like breathing with two lungs. So today we're just dealing, with Kant and Marion, the concept of the saturated phenomenon, how it transgresses the Kantian principles and categories for pure understanding, quantity, quality, relation, modality. So very technical stuff. But when we study philosophy, we're convinced along the way by a very careful evidence of thought. And so when we study Immanuel Kant, we're like, wow, it seems like he's getting a lot of things right here that other people before him didn't notice, didn't say, didn't develop. And here he is developing them. And then, but we're also wondering what might be the limitations and the weaknesses of an individual philosopher and the system they've developed. I would say we want to be very careful in philosophy of any kind of system, of any kind of camp, of any kind of ism, because what these things can bring is reductionism and a closure of the questions. But we have to let the question in philosophy lead us by the hand to the full flowering of its answer and what we say of the truth. So thanks again for this question, Imran. You have so many good ones that you bring, and I appreciate them very much. So do saturated phenomena convey meaning for Marion, as they do identically for Husserl, or do these phenomena exceed description? Yes, we could say, by definition, they defy definition. Saturated phenomena exceed description because they exceed our index of concepts we might have ready to name them and tame them. So saturated phenomena, because of their excess, they convey meaning, but we could say every saturated phenomena means more than it means more than the human subject is able to allow it to mean because of the limitations of subjectivity and first person point of view. So we allow saturated phenomena the full resonance of their harmonious meanings, their symphony of meaning, through the community of witnesses. And this is why religious experience is such a helpful test bed for the method of phenomenology, because we have these communities of witnesses around different traditions dealing with divinity, and we might think of what is the most saturating concept even we have in the dictionary of concepts. Is it not divinity? Is it not this little word God? Does that word not signify the heights of possibility, the heights of actuality for classical metaphysics? The superlative of saturation? Is not divinity that concept? I can't think of another one that rivals it in terms of saturation. So when we attend to religious experience that concerns itself with the divine, then we end up with the greatest playing field for the philosophical project, the greatest laboratory for experimentation, to use this analogy from empiricism. But so yeah, from Marion, saturated phenomena mean so much that sometimes they mean so little. That is to say, they reduce us to silence, that our words start to trail off because of how they overpower perception, thought, our possible responses to them. And so something like contemplative prayer within religious experience, or like the field of mysticism, is we can describe in phenomenology, wow, this is what's going on here. There's less being said. And it doesn't mean there's less being meant, but there's both a saturation of meaning and in such ways that there's hidden meanings always to be found, always to be discovered, that they may have given themselves, but we didn't detect them. And we have to come back around to the experience again to be on the lookout, to be listening for new meanings to mean themselves within the religious experience. So there's an excess. One of Marion's books, a collection of essays on these topics, is called In Excess. The saturated phenomenon is in excess. And in terms of meaning, but with Marion, it's that, again, I've said it previously, there's like a dark side, not in terms of evil, but in terms of concealment. And we have this in Heidegger with Sein. Sein discloses itself to the degree that it conceals itself. So the saturated phenomena, the same sort of thing is happening. There's disclosure and concealment, but more to be disclosed the more that we attend to the saturation. Whew. So thank you all so much for this great time thinking through Immanuel Kant and the principles of pure understanding in terms of quantity, quality, relation, modality, and how Jean-Luc Marion's concept, but more than a concept, the phenomenon, the saturated phenomenon, transgresses these Kantian categories and causes us to rethink them according to the givenness of the phenomenon. Thank you so much. May you continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you on the next one.